You think you know the Vikings, dragon ships, brutal raids, warriors carving through Europe. But there's a darker thread running through it all that almost nobody talks about. What happened to the women they captured? Not the common folk, the noble women, daughters of kings, sisters of chieftains, women who had power, wealth, and protection until the day a Norse ship appeared on the horizon, 821, the coast of Ireland. The annals of Ulster document it cold and simple. Raiders hit the village of Atar. They didn't come for gold. They came for people. The chronicle states they carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not men, women. This was strategic. This was intentional. And for the women of high birth among them, what came next was calculated to break them in ways death never could. The Vikings understood value. A noblewoman wasn't just a body. She was leverage, ransom weight measured in silver, a way to drain an enemy's treasury without swinging a sword. But here's what makes your skin crawl. The ransom wasn't guaranteed. While negotiations dragged on, these women existed in a state worse than captivity. They were commodities on display, available for purchase, available for use, and the Vikings had built an entire economic system around it. Dublin, 9th century. By the time the Norse established their settlement, it had become one of the primary slave markets in the entire Viking world. The life of St. Findan, written in the late 9th century, gives us a window into how this worked. Findan came from noble Leinster stock. His sister was taken by Vikings. His father sent him with silver to get her back. Standard ransom procedure. Except Findan himself was captured during the negotiation. He was sold, then sold again, then sold a third time, then a fourth. Passed from one raiding group to another, like currency. Each time, the price changed. Each time, the distance from home grew. His sister's fate is never recorded. This is the machine. Dublin operated like a hub, Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, Bulgar on the Volga in what's now Russia. These weren't just trading posts. They were human markets operating on an industrial scale. Archaeological evidence from Dublin towards Birkas and Hedeby reveals iron collars and shackles, not designed for animals, designed for people, found concentrated near harbor areas where the trade happened. The locations tell the story. These restraints sat waiting in commercial districts, close to ships, close to buyers. The price system was cold mathematics. In early medieval Ireland, a female captive was called a cumal. The term literally became a unit of value. 1 cumal equaled 3 ounces of silver, 8 to 10 cows, a piece of land, a human woman reduced to an accounting entry. In Icelandic sagas, the merchant Huskolder bought an Irish captive named Melkorka for 3 marks of silver. The same saga notes other captive women sold for 1 mark each. The difference? Status, beauty. Perceived value. Melkorka was noble, the others were common, and that distinction determined everything. But noble birth didn't guarantee ransom. Sometimes families couldn't pay. Sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes the political situation made negotiation impossible. When ransom failed, the second option activated: permanent slavery. And for noble women, this represented a specific kind of destruction. They went from positions of authority, managing households, controlling resources, making decisions, to being property. The law codes are explicit. In Norwegian legal language, slaves and slave women were referred to using neuter gender, not human, not people, objects, advanced domestic animals, the sources say. They lived in the darkest end of the longhouse with the livestock. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat traveling along the Volga in 922, documented what he saw when he encountered Viking merchants. He described 2 attractive girls intended for sale. While they waited, their owners sexually abused them, publicly, while others watched. Fadlan wrote this down. He was horrified. But to the Vikings, this was normal. These women were merchandise being tested, displayed, used. Their bodies weren't their own. The National Museum of Denmark's research into slave practices confirms the slaves' bodies were available for sexual exploitation without restriction. This was systematic. This was expected. The archaeological record backs this up. Anna Kjellström, osteologist at Stockholm University, examined skeletal remains of presumed Viking-era slaves found in graves across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Published research from her work reveals signs of abuse and decapitation. Some slaves were buried alongside their masters, not as honored companions, as property, as sacrifices, as things that followed their owners into death because they had no choice in life. Consider what this meant for a noble woman. 1 week she's managing an estate, wearing fine clothing, making decisions, protected by family, by status, by law. The next week, she's chained in the hold of a ship, stripped, examined, purchased, and the work began immediately. Textile production. This was the primary labor Vikings extracted from female slaves. Archaeological and historical research from Uppsala University's Viking Phenomenon Project confirms slave-driven production of textiles funded the Viking expansion. One sail for a long ship required approximately 5 years of labor for a single person to produce. The wool, the spinning, the weaving, multiply that by hundreds of ships. The math demands thousands of enslaved hands, women's hands, and many of those hands had once worn silver rings and managed households. If you value documented history and factual research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources including Anna Kjellström's peer-reviewed osteological studies published through Stockholm University examining skeletal remains across Scandinavia showing evidence of abuse. The article, Bound in Captivity, Intersections of Viking Raiding, Slaving, and Settlement in Western Europe during the 9th century, published in Scandinavian Journal of History in 2022, which details 9th century captive taking practices using primary chronicles. And The Slave Markets of the Viking World, published in the journal Slavery and Abolition in 2019, analyzing archaeological evidence from Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka, alongside historical accounts, including Ibn Fadlan's first-hand 922 observations. Now back to the information. The sexual abuse wasn't incidental, it was structural. William Fitzhugh from the Smithsonian Institution stated plainly in research published through the National Geographic Society that female slaves served as concubines, cooks, and domestic workers. The order matters. Sexual availability came first, work came second. For a noblewoman, this meant everything she'd been raised to expect, every protection her birth should have guaranteed, stripped away, replaced with systematic assault. The sagas reference this casually. The law codes acknowledge it without condemn. The archaeological evidence shows the children who resulted from these unions, traceable through DNA analysis in sites across Iceland and the North Atlantic Norse settlements. Iceland offers a particularly ugly window into this system. Genetic studies published in journals including the American Journal of Physical Anthropology reveal that the majority of founding female lineages in Iceland trace to the British Isles. The majority of male lineages trace to Scandinavia. The math is simple and horrifying. Viking men sailed west. They took women. They settled Iceland with those captive women as the maternal founding population. Some sagas romanticize this, like the tale of Melkorka, the Irish princess who pretended to be mute. But strip away the literary decoration and you're left with forced migration and sexual slavery on a settlement scale. The treatment intensified if you resisted, or if you weren't useful enough, or if your master died. Human sacrifice at Viking burials is documented in both textual and archaeological sources. Balatear on the Isle of Man provides the clearest British example. Excavated in 1946 by Gerhard Bersu, a Viking male buried in an oak coffin with sword, spear, shield, knife. Rich burial, high status, between 18 and 30 years old. Above him, buried in the upper mound, a woman aged 20 to 30. Her skull shows catastrophic trauma, the back of it sliced off by a sword blow while she was alive. Her body placed 12 to 72 hours after death with 7 centimeters of cremated animal bones spread over her. Horse, ox, sheep, dog, all killed for the funeral. And her, she had no grave goods, no dignity, no ceremony of her own. Just a skull crushed by metal and a body dumped in the mound as one more possession following a man into the ground. This wasn't unique. Elise Naumann, archaeologist at the University of Oslo, analyzed decapitated bodies from several Viking tombs. DNA analysis proved these individuals weren't related to the primary burial. Isotope analysis of their teeth showed different diets. The masters ate meat and dairy, the slaves ate fish and grain, lower quality, less protein. The bones tell stories of malnutrition and stress even before the violent deaths. Naumann's research, published in archaeological journals, identifies these as likely slave sacrifices, matching patterns described in both Ibn Fadlan's account and in Icelandic sagas. Ibn Fadlan's description from 922 provides the most detailed textual evidence we have. A Rus chieftain died. A slave girl volunteered to die with him. Volunteered is generous. She was given alcohol for 10 days, elevated status temporarily, dressed well. Then came the funeral. She was taken into a tent on the funeral ship. 6 men had intercourse with her in sequence. Then she was strangled with a rope, while an old woman they called the Angel of Death stabbed her repeatedly between the ribs. She was then placed in the ship next to her dead master, and the whole thing was burned. Fadlan documented this. He was traumatized, but he wrote it down with the detail of a man trying to make sense of something incomprehensible to his worldview. Now map that account onto the archaeological evidence. The Balater woman, the decapitated individuals in Norwegian and Swedish graves, the signs of violence and ritual, the lack of kinship, the differential treatment, the pattern repeats. Noble birth offered no protection here. If you were captured, if you were enslaved, if your master died, you might follow him, not as an honor, as property. Scholars debate whether the Balater woman was executed, sacrificed, or killed to release evil spirits. The debate misses the point. She died violently and without agency. Her body was disposed of like the cremated animals around her. The Flakstad burial in Norway's Lofoten Islands shows the same pattern. Multiple individuals buried with a high status person, decapitated, different genetic profiles. Evidence of maltreatment in the bones. The Grimsta grave in Sweden. 2 decapitated men buried together, possibly slaves, possibly sacrificed. The repetition across geography and time suggests system, not anomaly. Here's what the sources don't talk about much. The waiting. The uncertainty. A noble woman, taken captive, didn't know which path she'd walk. Ransom? Maybe. Her family might be negotiating, or they might not. She could wait months in a Viking encampment, what the Irish chronicles called Long Fort. These weren't just defensive camps. Archaeological research published in Scandinavian Journal of History in 2022 demonstrates they were militarized centers of production and exchange, markets where captives were held, ransomed, exploited, and sold. While she waited, she existed in legal limbo, not dead, not free, available. The Annals of Ulster record 23 separate instances where Vikings took prisoners en masse for slaving operations. These weren't small raids. By the mid-9th century, Viking fleets were taking hundreds, possibly thousands of people captive in coordinated campaigns. The scale was industrial. 844 Imtwardarings, Franker, Seville, Viking raid. The Arabic sources document it. 859 as Morocco. The geographical treatise, Kitab al-Masalik wal-Mamalik, describes 2 women from the royal harem taken and held until the Emir of Cordoba ransomed them. Noble women, political leverage. But during the captivity, before the ransom, what happened? The sources don't specify. They don't need to. We have Ibn Fadlan. We have the slave markets. We have the legal codes that say slaves' bodies were available for use. Portugal, 1015. A charter survives. A man named Amarello Mestalis describing how Vikings arrived in July. Occupied territory between the Douro and Ave rivers for 9 months. They captured his 3 daughters, Cirili, Ermesenda, Fakilo. He had nothing to give the Northmen. They were going to sell his daughters. He had no choice. He paid a ransom of silver. 2 years later, he was still selling land to clear the debt. His daughters were noble. Their father was nobility. It didn't matter. They were merchandise until silver changed hands. Another Portuguese document from 1026 tells of Octicio. His wife Matilde and daughter Gunsina were captured. He paid for their release with a wolfskin blanket, a sword, a shirt, 3 scarves, a cow, and 3 measures of ground salt. That was the price of 2 noble women, a blanket, and a cow. The chronicles from Archbishop Rimbert of Bremen, who died in 888 high, describe a large throng of captured Christians hauled through Hedeby. Among them, a woman singing psalms to identify herself as a Christian nun. Religious nobility. Rimbert exchanged his horse for her freedom. 1 nun, 1 horse. Direct trade. This was the economy. The emotional destruction ran deeper than physical abuse. These women had been raised for power. They knew how to run estates, manage people, navigate politics. They had status, education, protection. And one day, that ended. They became animals in law. Things to be sold. Their knowledge meant nothing. Their birth meant nothing. Their humanity meant nothing. The psychological fracture of that transition is impossible to quantify, but easy to imagine. You don't just lose your freedom, you lose your personhood. The Icelandic poem, Rigsthula, likely dating from the end of the Viking era, preserves how Vikings viewed their slaves. The names assigned to thralls in the poem are bastard, sluggard, stumpy, stinker, lout. These weren't people. These were things with degrading labels. Imagine being a daughter of a king, knowing your lineage goes back generations, and being called stinker by the man who owns you. The name alone is violence. It erases you before you're even physically harmed. Women who had managed households now ground grain at querns. Women who had worn silk now wore rags. The saga of Laxdela describes Melkorka as poorly dressed when Huskuldr found her in the merchant's booth. After he bought her, he dressed her in fine clothes which suited her better. The implication sits there. She'd been stripped of everything, including clothing that matched her true status. Dressed as a slave to look like a slave, to be a slave. Your clothing announced your degradation before you said a word. The labor was backbreaking. Slaves handled the hardest and most unpleasant work in the fields. The archaeological research on Viking Age farms suggests significant numbers of slaves provided labor for great building projects, for agriculture, for textile production. The timeline to produce one ship's sail meant enslaved women spent years spinning wool, weaving, processing fibers. Their hands never stopped. A noblewoman who'd once supervised workers now was the worker, supervised by others, beaten if she slowed down. Norwegian legal texts state an owner could punish slaves as much as wanted. No limit, no protection. The darkest end of the longhouse. That's where slaves lived according to the sources from the National Museum of Denmark, with the animals, the smoke, the cold, the filth. While the family occupied the warm end near the fire, slaves slept in darkness with livestock. A noblewoman who'd slept in a proper bed, who'd had servants, who'd had privacy, now slept on dirt with cattle. The sensory degradation alone would be crushing. The smell, the cold, the constant proximity to animals and their waste, the complete absence of personal space or dignity, and the threat of death hung constant. If you got sick, they might leave you to die. Ibn Fadlan documented this. If a slave became ill, they'd set up a tent away from camp, throw the slave inside with bread and water, and leave them. No care, no treatment. If they recovered, fine. If they died, leave the body for dogs and birds. No burial, no ceremony. You weren't worth the effort to put you in the ground. Archaeological evidence supports this. Slave remains show signs of untreated injuries and diseases that would have been agonizing. The sexual slavery for noblewomen carried specific trauma. These were women raised to make strategic marriages. Their virginity, their reputation, their marriage prospects were all carefully managed. Capture destroyed all of that instantly. The sources state clearly that slaves' bodies were sexually available to their owners. Publicly sometimes, like the girls Ibn Fadlan saw. The humiliation was part of the system. It wasn't enough to assault you. It had to be visible, witnessed, normalized. You became an object of use in front of other people, reinforcing that you had no privacy, no bodily autonomy, no human dignity left. If you became pregnant, the child was born into slavery. Some women bore children to their captors, and those children inherited slave status unless the father chose to acknowledge them. The Icelandic settlement patterns show this happened frequently. Women gave birth to half Norse children who were raised as either slaves or as lower status members of households. Your child became property. Your motherhood became another form of exploitation. The escape attempts rarely succeeded. The life of St. Findon shows how difficult it was. After being sold multiple times, Findon managed to escape by hiding in a cave during a storm. He nearly drowned. He spent a day and night without food while his former owners searched for him. They walked over the rock he hid under, calling his name. When he finally escaped the cave, he discovered he was on an island. No escape route. He was only freed when another group of Vikings decided it was wrong to hold him since he'd originally come to ransom someone. His sister was never freed. For women, especially noble women with no combat training, no knowledge of local geography, marked by their gender and often their language, escape was nearly impossible. The few who did escape faced massive obstacles. An Irish bishop held on Dalkey Island in 940 tried to escape and died in the attempt. The Icelandic Book of Settlements tells of Irish slaves who revolted in early Iceland. They were all killed. The message was clear. Resistance meant death. Escape meant death. Compliance might mean survival, but survival in slavery, where every day stripped away more of who you were. The market dynamics were ruthless. If you weren't useful, your value dropped. If you were too old, your value dropped. If you got injured and couldn't work, your value dropped. At that point, you might be sold again for less, or simply discarded. The cost-benefit analysis applied to human beings. Noble women discovered their birth meant nothing against basic economic calculation. Can you work? Can you produce? Can you be sold? Those were the only questions that mattered. The Viking expansion itself may have been driven partly by the need for slaves. Neil Price, distinguished professor at Uppsala University, argues in his research that the massive shipbuilding programs of the 9th century required enormous labor forces. Who built those ships? Who produced the sails? Who mined the tar? Slave labor. The scale of Viking expansion demanded a constant supply of enslaved people to maintain the infrastructure. Noble women captured in raids were part of that labor pool. Their status before capture was irrelevant to the economic engine that consumed them. The trade routes stretched across the known world. Captives taken in Ireland could end up in Byzantium. Captives from the British Isles ended up in Scandinavia, Iceland, the Volga region, North Africa. The 10th century geographer Ibn Haukwal wrote in 977 of a Viking slave trade extending across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. You could be captured in Scotland and sold in Cairo. Noble birth didn't anchor you to home. It just made you more valuable in distant markets. The Spillings hoard found in Gotland contains over 14,000 coins in hack silver. Much of it Arab dirhams, silver from the Islamic world that flowed into Scandinavia in exchange for goods, including slaves. The weight of silver in these hoards represents thousands of transactions. Each coin touched multiple hands. Each transaction involved something sold, often someone sold. The financial archaeology maps the slave economy. The silver moved west, the people moved east. Noble women from Ireland ended up as far as the Caspian Sea. The systematic nature becomes clearer when you map the archaeological sites. Dublin, Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang, Staraya Ladoga, Novgorod, Kiev. These weren't random settlements, they were nodes in a network. A supply chain for humans, major trading centers with evidence of shackles, with references to slave sales and historical texts, with genetic evidence of foreign populations, with signs of wealth generated through trade. The placement tells you this was organized, coordinated, professional. Research published in the journal Slavery and Abolition in 2019 examined the form and function of these slave market sites. The conclusion, based on comparative archaeology and historical sources, indicates these markets operated as multifunctional centers, embedded in regional and long-distance trade networks. They weren't purpose-built. They were adaptable. Space in Dublin could function as a general marketplace one day and a slave market the next. The flexibility made the system more efficient, more profitable, harder to disrupt. The silver bullion and the weighing equipment found at these sites and at Viking raiding camps tells you commerce happened everywhere, not just in established towns. When Viking fleets encamped during campaigns, they set up temporary markets. Captives were bought and sold in these camps. The research from Ben Raffield at Uppsala University identifies evidence of silver transactions at 9th century Viking encampments across Europe. This means noble women captured during raids were being sold before the raiders even returned home. Immediate liquidation of assets, maximum profit, minimum delay. Think about that. Your village is burning. You're captured. Within days, possibly within hours, you're being sold. No time to hope for rescue. No time for your family to organize ransom. The speed of the transaction meant you were already miles away, owned by someone new, before anyone back home even knew exactly what happened. The Vikings optimized their supply chain. The system was brutally efficient. A supply chain optimized not for goods, but for people. And for the noble woman caught in its gears, the speed of the transaction was just the beginning of a calculated process of erasure. The journey from the burning shore of her home to the slave block in Dublin or the market stalls of the Volga was a journey into nothingness, stripped of name, of clothing, of language, of identity. But what happened after the sale? What happened to the women who survived the initial shock and found themselves living within the machine? The horror did not end at the auction block. It simply changed its form. Consider the lucky ones, the ransomed. We have the document from 1015. Amarilla Mestalis selling his land for 2 years to buy back his 3 noble daughters, Cirili, Ermesenda, and Fakilo. He succeeded. They came home. But what home did they return to? The sources are silent on the aftermath, but the social realities of the era speak for them. A noblewoman's value was intrinsically tied to her reputation, her purity, and her strategic marriage potential. A woman who had been a captive, a cumul, a piece of property in a Northman's camp for months, was considered damaged, tainted. The ransom itself was a public declaration of what had happened. The entire community would know. Her father's crippling debt was a constant reminder. Could she still command respect from the servants she once managed? Could she secure the high-status marriage she was raised for? Unlikely. She was a ghost in her own home, haunted by what had been done to her and ostracized by the very society that should have protected her. The psychological wounds were invisible but permanent. Her captors had not only stolen her freedom for a time, they had stolen her future. She was returned, but she was never whole again. She lived in a third space, no longer captive, but never truly free of the captivity. This was a different kind of life sentence. For those not ransomed, the process of dehumanization was systematic and intentional. It began with language. A captured Irish or Frankish noblewoman would find herself surrounded by the harsh sounds of Old Norse. Her own tongue, the language of her power and poetry, was useless. The inability to understand commands, threats, or even simple conversations was a tool of control. It isolated her. It made her dependent. It reduced her from a thinking, communicating person to a confused animal, reacting only to gestures and angry shouts. The story of Melkorka, the Irish princess who pretended to be mute, is famous, but for most, the muteness was not a choice, it was imposed. They were silenced before their will was ever broken. Then came the new name. The Rigstula poem gives us the labels sluggard, stinker, lout. These were not just insults. They were tools of psychological demolition. Imagine being named Fakilo, a name carrying the weight of your lineage, and being renamed Thrall woman or something even more degrading. The new name was a daily reinforcement of your new status. It was a brand on your soul. Every time it was spoken, it reminded you that the person you used to be was dead. The person who answered to that new, ugly sound was a thing, a piece of property. The physical environment was another weapon. A noblewoman accustomed to stone halls, fine tapestries, and personal space was thrust into the longhouse. Legal codes and archaeological reconstructions from sites across Scandinavia confirm the social geography of these buildings. The master's family lived in the center, near the warmth and light of the main hearth. The slaves lived at the ends, often sharing their space with the livestock brought in for the winter. The cold, the darkness, the stench of animal waste, the complete lack of privacy. This was a sensory assault designed to grind a person down. You didn't just lose your status, you lost the basic dignity of living like a human. You slept, ate, and existed like the cattle beside you, because in the eyes of your captors, that is what you had become. The work was endless, a physical manifestation of this new reality. Textile production, as confirmed by research from Uppsala University, was the engine of the Viking economy, and it ran on the labor of enslaved women. But it wasn't just the weaving of sails, it was grinding grain for hours at a heavy quernstone, a task so grueling it left its mark on skeletal remains studied by osteologists. It was hauling water, tending fires, cooking, cleaning, and serving the family that owned you. The hands that once held embroidery needles or managed household accounts were now chapped, broken, and raw from manual labor. This physical transformation was a constant reminder of their fall. Every aching muscle, every broken nail, screamed their new reality. And watching over this all was the master's wife, the Norse woman who ran the household. It's a mistake to imagine some kind of solidarity between these women. The master's wife was not an ally. She was the manager of the household property, and the enslaved noblewoman was part of that property. The sagas are filled with instances of cruel and jealous wives tormenting female slaves, especially those who caught the master's eye. The wife held the keys to the stores. She allocated the food. She assigned the tasks. She meted out the punishments for the captive. The master was a source of sexual violence and brute force, but his wife was the architect of her daily misery. The children born from this systemic rape represented the ultimate paradox of the system. Genetic studies from Iceland and the Faroe Islands have proven that the founding maternal population came largely from the British Isles, while the paternal lines were overwhelmingly Norse. This is the genetic scar of the entire slave system. But what of the children themselves? Legally, a child's status followed the mother. If you were born to an enslaved woman, you were born a slave. You were the property of your mother's owner, who was also your father. This created a household dynamic of unimaginable cruelty. Your father owned you, your half-siblings, born to his Norse wife, were his free heirs who might one day inherit you as part of the estate. You were a constant, living symbol of your mother's violation and your father's power. While some fathers chose to free their children, this was the exception, not the rule. Most grew up as slaves in their own father's house, a permanent underclass. For the noblewoman mother, this was the final turn of the screw. Not only was her body used to produce a child, but that child was then stolen from her into the same system that had consumed her. She had created more property for her master. Yet, even in this hopeless situation, there were whispers of resistance. Not open rebellion, that, as the Icelandic Book of Settlements shows, was met with swift and total annihilation. The resistance was quieter, more personal. It was Melkorka's feigned muteness, a way to control the one thing they couldn't physically take, her voice. It was teaching her son, Olaf the Peacock, her native Irish language in secret. This was an act of profound defiance. It was a way of saying, "You do not own my memory. You do not own my culture. I will pass it on." It might have been more subtle things, a deliberate flaw woven into a sail that might fail in a high wind, a misunderstood instruction, a song hummed quietly in a forgotten language. These were small acts, microscopic in the face of the overwhelming power of the system, but they were acts of survival. They were proof that the person inside had not been completely erased. Of course, the punishment for being caught would be severe. The Norwegian legal texts were clear. An owner could punish a slave as much as they wanted. A beating for a flawed sail or a forbidden song was a small price to pay for a moment of agency. The system's final act of control was over death itself. As the Balater burial and the decapitated skeletons in Norwegian graves show, a slave's life could be extinguished to serve the master's death. But there was also the casual disregard for their lives when they were no longer useful. Ibn Fadlan's account of the sick slave, left in a tent with bread and water, is chilling. There was no care, there was no attempt to heal. A slave was a tool. If the tool broke, you did not fix it. You discarded it. The archaeological record echoes this. Skeletons of slaves show evidence of untreated fractures, debilitating arthritis, and severe malnutrition. They were worked until they broke, and then they were thrown away. For a noblewoman who had been raised to expect care and respect in sickness and old age, this was the ultimate negation of her humanity. Her life had no intrinsic value. It only had use value. When the use was gone, so was the life. So why did this vast transcontinental system of human trafficking eventually decline? There was no single cause, but a slow convergence of factors. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries played a significant role. While Christianity did not immediately abolish slavery, it did introduce a new moral framework. The church frowned upon the enslavement of fellow Christians, which made raiding places like Ireland and England more problematic. The trade shifted, focusing more on the pagan Slavic lands to the east, but the ideological foundation of the old system was cracking. Simultaneously, the political landscape was changing. The Viking age of independent chieftains launching private raids was ending. Powerful, centralized kingdoms were emerging in Denmark, Norway and Spas, and Sweden. Kings wanted to monopolize violence. They wanted to tax trade, not have it conducted by rogue warriors. This consolidation of power made the kind of large-scale slaving expeditions of the 9th century much more difficult to organize and execute. Furthermore, their victims were fighting back more effectively. The kingdoms of Ireland and the Anglo-Saxon territories of England became more militarily organized. Fortified towns, or burhs, were built. Fleets were raised. The Vikings found that raiding was no longer a low-risk, high-reward enterprise. The cost in men and ships began to outweigh the potential profit from captives and plunder. The economic calculation that had driven the slave trade for centuries was beginning to shift. The machine was becoming inefficient, but the machine left its ghost. Its legacy is indelible, written in the DNA of millions of people today. The story of the Viking Age is often told as a saga of male warriors, explorers, and kings, but this other story, the story of the women they captured, is just as crucial. It is the dark matter of the Viking world. The invisible engine that powered the ships, clothed the warriors, and populated new lands. It is the story of thousands of noblewomen, Cirili, Ermesenda, Fakilo, Melkorka, and countless others whose names are lost to us, who were ripped from positions of power and systematically broken down into objects. They were not footnotes in the Viking story. They were the fuel, and their silence in the historical record does not mean they were not there. It is merely the sound of their erasure, a sound that echoes in the bones, in the genes, and in the cold, hard ground from Dublin to Kiev.